Hello, I hope you all are doing well. We're going to continue examining economic health. What makes a healthy economy? For that matter, what makes a sick economy? We already looked at unemployment and how that can either make things go really well or it can mess things up, and some of the problems associated with how we measure it. Today, we're going to talk about price changes. We know that prices go up and down all of the time, but how do we define those things and how do they affect the economy as a whole? Then we're going to dive into inflation. What are the types of inflation? Some of the causes of it. How can consumers affect it? How can businesses affect inflation? And how can the government affect inflation? Then, of course, we have to look at how we measure this. How do we know that the economy is doing good or bad, that inflation is high or low, or if it's climbing or if it's going down? How do we figure that stuff out? What are the tools that we use to determine inflation in our economy? And then finally, we're going to take a look at some of the controls that we try to implement. How do we try to keep inflation from going way too high, or how do we keep inflation from going just too low into a deflationary state? What are the things that the government can do? What are the policies and the organizations that make it so that we try to manipulate our economic health? So let's get started. So before we start talking about the health of the economy, what that is, how we measure it, what is the determining factors in that, there's 4 things we need to know about. The first one is inflation. And you say, I know, Mr. Bowles, that's when prices go up, and they always go up. Well, you're kind of right. But there's more to it than that, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. Our definition for right now is that it's the general increase in prices and the fall of purchasing power over a period of time. Our next one is deflation. That's when prices fall. That's a good thing, right? Oh, not so fast. Deflation can be very detrimental to the economy, and it could be worse than inflation in some cases. But here's our definition. It's the reduction of the general level of prices in an economy. It can cause stalled consumer spending and unemployment. We'll talk about how in a little bit. Our next definition is stagflation. This is just a mixture of 2 words, very creative. Stagnation, which means it's just sitting there not doing anything, and inflation, which we just defined. So this is persistent high inflation and an unemployment rate that's really high in a stagnant economy. And our last definition that we need to talk about before we can get into all of this is hyperinflation. This is what happened in Germany before World War II. This is what happened in Zimbabwe. This is what's happening in Venezuela. So, hyperinflation is a rapid and often uncontrollable currency devaluation. The value of money goes down, causing prices of goods and services to skyrocket in a short period of time. So, let's take a look at inflation. We talked about inflation and we said that it's prices going up over a certain amount of time. But there's certain aspects of the economy that can drive inflation to either go higher or go lower. And in order to maintain a healthy economy, we need to try to control these factors of inflation. So we need to know what they are. Now, the first one is cost push inflation. This is also known as supply side inflation because it's anything that has to do with the inputs of business, like labor or raw materials. If the price of metal goes up, then the price of making a car is going to go up as well, because the inputs into making that product, the inputs into business, have gotten higher. So if there's a supply side driver of inflation, then we know that there has to be a demand side driver of inflation as well. And this is called demand pull inflation. This is when too many customers are bidding to purchase too few goods, and this is going to make the price go up. If you want something and somebody else wants something, whoever is willing to pay the most is going to be able to purchase the product. Now this can be fear driven as well. When people are afraid of inflation, they know that prices keep on going up and keep on going up. It's going to make them not save money. It's going to make them spend it now, because if you buy it now, it's going to be cheaper than when down the road the price goes higher. So when you have everybody doing that, then you have more people bidding on the same products, which drives the price of it up. It becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So then prices go up higher, so then people want to spend money faster, which makes the prices go up higher again. Another major driver of inflation has to do with the money supply. If there's an increase in the money supply, like the government prints a bunch of money and it's distributed into the economy, then prices are going to go up. But you say, how could too much money be a problem? Well, the more money that's out there, the less your money is worth. If you have $10 in your hand and the government prints another $10, then your $10 is only worth $5 now, because there's twice as much money out there than you had in your hand. So the more money that's printed diminishes the value of each individual dollar depending on the overall amount of currency that's in the marketplace. So the part of this inflationary equation that is important to us, just the normal citizen trying to go about their daily business, trying to save money and be fiscally responsible, is going to be purchasing power. That's what all these things add up to, is the amount of physical goods and services that my single unit of money can buy. So I have a bunch of money. Perhaps today I can buy something. Tomorrow I might not be able to buy the same thing. And then over time this looks a little bit different, because you might go to your boss and ask for a raise, and you've been a decent employee, so your boss says, okay, I'll give you a raise, and they give you a 2% raise. Well, since you've been working there, the inflation has gone up 5%. So because inflation is higher, the raise that you got, you're poorer than you were before. Your purchasing power has gone down. You cannot, even with your raise that you got, buy the same amount of stuff that you can when you started the job. The same thing goes for the banking system. If you try to open up a savings account and that savings account has a 1% interest rate on it, then in 2 or 3 years, the amount of money that you put in is not going to be able to buy what it could at the very beginning, because the interest rate is lower than the inflation rate. The inflation goes up faster than the interest in your bank account. So now that we know what inflation is and what some of the drivers are behind it, we need to know how to measure it. So if it needs to be controlled, we know what to do. Is it going up? Is it going down? How do we know? Well, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics uses what's called a Consumer Price Index. This is going to be called CPI all of the time because we love 3-lettered acronyms. So the Consumer Price Index is just a bunch of typical goods that wage earners buy all of the time, and they take the average of these and they compare it at different points in time. They call this the market basket. Now this market basket is pretty important. These are the things that they estimate that the average American consumer is going to be buying throughout
the year. It's stuff that people buy all of the time. You're paying money for the house that you're in, whether it's your mortgage or your rent. You have to buy food, you have to buy things to drink, you have to buy clothes. You have to either have a car or buy a bike or get a bus pass. You have to transport yourself somehow. Everyone's going to have medical expenses, education, recreational expenses. They try to accumulate all these things and have them included in this basket. Of course, this is an imprecise measure, and there's a couple of things that go wrong with it, but it is the best measure we have at the moment for inflation. There's another one that's called the Core Inflation Index, and that takes out food and energy costs, because the price of food and oil is always going up and down, and they're interdependent on each other. But for right now, let's just look at the CPI and the market basket that they base the CPI on. So one of the things that's difficult to do with the CPI and the market basket, one of the things that makes it more imprecise or might make it a little bit inaccurate, is called substitution bias. Now, this is based on the idea that people aren't going to buy furniture for their house every year. And you buy a bed and a dresser and a nightstand, and you're going to keep that stuff for a few years. You're not going to continually be buying this over and over and over again. A car, you're not going to buy a car every single year. So instead of spending that money on that particular piece of the CPI or the market basket, you're going to be putting that money into another place. Now, another aspect of this substitution bias is the fact that different brands cost different for the same type of item. You can buy one pair of shoes and it could cost $300 because it's a really expensive name brand type of shoe, or you can go to Costco and you can buy the cheap shoe and get it for $20. They're both shoes, but they both cost really different. So the substitution bias, either you're not buying the same things all the time because you already have it, or you're changing one thing for another that either costs a lot more because you're doing well and you have a lot of money, or something that costs a lot less because you might not have money at the time. So that's something that can make this a little inaccurate. It's still the best measure that we have. Another problem with the Consumer Price Index and the market basket is the things that are in the basket can change over time. The telephones that were around in the 1970s are a whole lot different than in today's world of 2020, where our phones are more of a computer than they are phones. We have computers that will make a phone call. We don't have telephones anymore. So to try to compare these two things over time, sure, the price has gone up, but the functionality and the technology has advanced 1,000-fold over. So you're not even really comparing the same thing anymore. The TV sets of the 1950s and 60s, where they're black and white, they have 3 channels, are not comparable to an 82-inch flat screen TV that you can talk to, that connects to the internet, that you don't even need regular airwaves anymore. You get all of this digital information in super high definition. That's one of the problems we have, is even though these things are in the market basket and the price has gone up over time, with technological advancements, these aren't even the same things anymore. It's comparing apples and oranges. Now, most countries have what's called a central banking system. This is the regulatory authority, the main bank that's over all of the other banks in their country. In the United States, we call ours the Federal Reserve. It's our central banking system. It was created in 1913 after a whole bunch of panics happened. A banking panic is when everybody runs to the bank and tries to pull their money out at the same time, and then if the bank doesn't have money, well, there's a big problem and people can get violent and riots and things can start over it. So they figured they needed some sort of way to regulate all of the banks. This was the answer. The Federal Reserve, their job is to try to alleviate financial crises from happening. The Federal Reserve has 3 goals. Their first one is to maximize employment. An economy is doing well when as many people in it are working as possible. We figured that out when we studied unemployment and looking at what's happening in the world today with the coronavirus and everything going on. People need to be working. Another goal that they have is to keep prices stable. We don't want prices shooting way up or going way down because that can affect the economy in a really bad way. And the third main thing that they do is they need to moderate interest rates. The interest rates are rates that banks charge people to lend money out, or that the Federal Reserve charges banks. They do a whole lot more than this, but these are the 3 things that we're going to concentrate on. So in order to meet these goals that the Federal Reserve has, they use their measurements, the CPI, the market basket, and other tools that they have, and then they apply contractionary or expansionary policies. A contractionary policy is meant to slow the economy down. This would be the Treasury printing off a lot of money, and then the Federal Reserve putting that money into the economy so inflation goes up a little bit. Raising taxes would be another contractionary type of policy. It's not popular, but it's a good way to slow the economy down if that's what needs to happen. Expansionary policies are there to speed it up. Now, you could do that with the money supply by not putting more money into the economy, but you can also do that with interest rates. If you cut an interest rate, it makes it easier for people to borrow money, so then they're going to be stimulating the economy more. Another tool that the Federal Reserve has to try to manipulate where the economy is going and what the health of it is called open market operations. And this is where they buy or they sell treasury bills, bonds, or securities to banks or from banks. If they sell them to the banks, then it's going to be more expensive for the banks to operate because the banks had to buy all of these bonds or bills or securities that the Fed sold them, so they have less money to operate with. If they buy them back, then banks are going to have more money, so they can loan more money out, so they can expand or contract the economy in that way. In the course of banking regulation, the Federal Reserve requires banks to have a certain amount of money on hand at all times. This is called the reserve requirement. So at the end of the day, the bank has to have this amount of money, and the federal government, the Federal Reserve, can change this amount of money that the bank has to have. If they bring that amount of money up, so the bank has to have more money, then they have less money to loan out at the end of the day. If they bring it down, then the bank has more money to operate with. So they use their contractionary and expansionary policy by raising and lowering this reserve requirement. Now, in order to meet the reserve requirement all of the time, sometimes banks have to borrow money from other banks. And the Federal Reserve sets the interest rate that happens at. So if they put the interest rate up really high, then banks aren't going to be as willing to lend out money to get close to that reserve they're going to want to have a little bit of a buffer there so that they don't have to pay that high interest rate. Now, if the Federal Reserve lowers that interest rate, then banks will be willing to gamble a little bit more because borrowing the money isn't going to hurt them that bad. So the federal funds rate is the interest rate that banks charge each other to lend money to another financial institution. And the final thing we're going to talk about is called the discount rate. And this is the rate that the Fed charges to loan money to the bank. So it's the interest rate on the money that banks borrow from the government to lend out to other people. Now, if you think about wholesale shopping, if you go to Costco or Sam's Club and you buy in bulk, everything's cheaper than if you had gone to your regular department stores. The same thing goes for banks. They get their rate a little bit cheaper and then they loan that money out. Well, the Federal Reserve determines what that rate is. So if they raise that rate up, then the banks, when they go to loan money out to somebody, they're going to have to raise their rates up as well. And same thing if they lower it. So it's another way that the Federal Reserve can manipulate using contractionary and expansionary policy to try to control the way that the economy is going. So these are some of the things that the Federal Reserve does. And their role has changed over time as the economy has changed and the state of the world has evolved, and we've gone through different crises and different wars. It's going to change, I'm sure, again after the coronavirus crisis has gone over. The world will never be the same. It's always changing. It's always evolving. We're going to talk about some more things that the Federal Reserve does, like quantitative easing and some of the reports that they put out. But for right now, I just want you to look at these things and get them down. Well, there you have it. We talked about economic health, some things besides unemployment that we look at to make sure that the economy is going the way that we would hope it would. We talked about some of these price changes, why things are not always the same, and how that happens. We talked about some of the drivers of inflation and how we measure inflation, the tools that we use to do that, and then the safeguards that the federal government has tried to put in place. For the better or worse, we don't know. We can argue about that. But the Federal Reserve is there to try to control inflation and deflation and keep the economy on course as we would want it to be. So as always, you guys, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.